I know what you're thinking. If Ori and the Blind Forest was so good, then why haven't they made an Ori 2? I've been an Ori fan ever since I played the first game back in 2017, and ever since then I've been looking forward to playing and experiencing this game up until its release. But Kai, why did you take so long to make this video? Ori 2 came out in March and you're just releasing the review for it now? I had other things to take care of in the meantime. To summarize my overall feelings towards Ori and the Will of the Wisps, I'd say that it improved on a lot of what was already established in Ori and the Blind Forest. Pretty much everything positive I can find to say about Ori 2 is already something that was great in the first Ori, or was a mechanic in the first game that Ori 2 went on to improve. If I'm to be completely honest, Ori 2 is a better game simply because of how faithful it was to the first game in keeping a similar aesthetic while also being a good sequel in terms of pushing the game forwards. Yet that isn't to say that Ori and the Blind Forest is a bad game at all, and since Will of the Wisps picks up after the events of the first game, I definitely had a better impression of Will of the Wisps knowing the events of its prequel and the significance of some characters. What I found to be the weakest aspects of Ori and the Will of the Wisps were some of the new concepts that they introduced and the fact that the story structure remains about the same between both games. It's an odd thing to bring up because most people that I know that have also played Ori and the Blind Forest also don't tend to tout its story as what sold them on the game. The issue lies in the fact that the way a story plays out in a video game very much influences the structure of gameplay that you're going to be presented with. When both Forest and Wisps have their story born out of a similar conflict, it makes the sequel even weaker in both its storytelling and gameplay structure, since the latter had time to consider a different angle and went with... Alright guys, I'm really pressed for time here, so let's just rehash the same story from the first game and have the characters separated by a storm, and there's also an owl villain that the main characters have to escape from, and Ori is the only character that can restore the forest to a state of natural tranquility. Yeah, one thing that really didn't impress me with the first Ori game was how the narration was basically like, everything was fine. Then suddenly... And you had to spend the rest of the game recovering from that then suddenly moment. Ori 2 does the exact same thing, and it's not like tropes aren't allowed to be repeated, but when a direct sequel in the same line of video games follows the same tropes, it comes off as lazy and awfully predictable. Not that Ori ever sets itself up to be unpredictable, or that its story elements should be something to detract from the rest of the game, but as a writer, I like it when writing is creative, or at least attempts to redefine tropes. When my favorite game does everything else so well, it's painful to see it push its characters through the same storytelling template. I already beat the first game, so I inherently know that Ori is capable of weathering a storm and overcoming her surroundings. And when the second game puts Ori in the same situation again, that recollection of her previously established ability to overcome said situation is well ingrained into my mind already. The first game has you go to 3 corners of the map to restore the elements of wind, water, and warmth to the rightful bastions so as to revert the decay that's slowly devouring the forest of Nibel. The second game has you go to 4 corners of the map to restore the different aspects of the forest of Nguyen to their rightful bastions in the Spirit Willow so as to revert the effects of the decay that's been slowly... Do you see my point here? Both forests are established to be at a different level of decay, with Nguyen being much further along as explained by multiple characters throughout the story, but it still doesn't mean that the conflict and execution on the overall structure is all that much different. Like I said before though, most people I know won't go out of their way to say that they loved Ori for the story, and I myself am included in that group of people I know. What immediately sold me on this game was its visual presentation, and Ori the Will of the Wisps follows up and improves on that presentation. I thought it wasn't going to be possible, yet here we are with what I think is a substantially better looking game. For starters, Ori and the Blind Forest, as beautiful as it was, had an issue with oversaturated colors and luminous objects giving off enough light to further contribute to my blindness. Ori was a bright white model, Sane was an orb of white light whose attacks exploded with more white light when they hit an enemy, Combine that with the bright orb that you have to carry through the Forlorn Ruins, which is a frozen wasteland mostly dominated by glaringly white and light blue particles, and you might as well be looking into the sun. This is an extreme example, but Ori and the Will of the Wisps has a location that serves a similar purpose. Bauer's Reach is a frozen wasteland where you have to reignite frozen pedestals, and the game could have done something similar with oversaturated blues and bright whites, but I was pleasantly surprised to find that the art team found out how to work an HSV slider. Instead of being barely noticeable, blues were now the most prominent color in the wintry area, with icy true blues standing out against the rest. Of course, with it being a snow-filled location, there is no way for it to avoid using whites, but just like the blues, they aren't as overwhelming as before, and are complemented quite nicely by charcoal grays and other darker tones in the earth that make up the mountain around it. Additionally, I'd like to add that I live in BC, Canada, and because of that, most of our winters are nothing more than gray, white, and more gray. So seeing a game represent winter as something that's more than an IRL grayscale filter was oddly satisfying for me. Another thing that Ori 2 does better in my opinion is greatly diversify its color palettes. Yes, with a wintry zone you are fairly limited in what you can use in terms of colors, but for other locations each area sticks out prominently in my mind as completely different from each other. The Wellspring Glades and Inkwater Marsh, while both were forested locations, offered great variety in their impact on both the story and appearance. On top of that, the colors that both of these locations use are directly tied to what part of the story they need to tell. Inkwater Marsh is the first place that the player encounters directly after Ori and Ku are separated by the storm. It's a dark and creepy place, which further sets in this sense of general uneasiness. As Ori, I genuinely feel out of place here, and while the Moki were non-hostile, the presentation of this area gave the impression that something could jump out and— oh no, what the heck is that? The Wellspring Glades, on the other hand, is set up as a home base for the player to return to. It's established as one of the last places largely untouched by the decay in Nguyen, and because of that, all manners of friendly creatures gather here. A general sense of calm and security is better set in by the soft golds and greens that really define the area. Nothing will hurt me here, but when I'm here, I get anxious and I want to poop my pants. The more intentional color choices is something that I wouldn't have noted as an improvement had Ori 2 not done so well to improve on what was already solid groundwork laid out by the first game. And looking back now, Ori and the Blind Forest different locations are relatively hard to differentiate on an aesthetic level because the largest difference that some locations offered were a different flat color in the background. The biggest and most noticeable difference between the two is the addition of NPCs that make Nguyen feel much more lived in. Now, Nguyen has been suffering from the effects of the decay for longer than Nibel was, but even then, having other characters interact with Ori made Nguyen far more memorable and alive than Nibel ever did. Characters like the timid but adorable Moki Grace, Qualok the Great, Ofer the Weapons Master, or Talk the cranky old traveling bird, and several others. Some of these NPCs are used to reimagine previously established systems that, just like the clearing of color palettes, I didn't know initially were changes that I needed. And those changes include the changes made to the energy and weapon system, and was by far the largest and most positive change that I saw come out of this game. The use of energy and weaponry in Ori and the Blind Forest felt rather one-note and disjointed from the amazing platforming that defines this series. You may be able to jump and dash around to your heart's content, but first let's sit still and repeatedly hit left click at a distance to clear that pesky enemy out of the way. Now with the way that weapons let you stay suspended in midair for a short duration of time while dealing adequate damage really adds to the fluidity of the movement. You can jump, dash, bash an enemy, smack them with a sword, and then bash again before you even have to touch the ground. There's no way for me to say it aside from it just feels right, man. And I can't believe that this wasn't what Ori had in the first game. By far my favorite way to deal with enemies was just by bashing them repeatedly with the hammer. There's just something about Ori swinging around this massive mallet and knocking enemies clean out that feels immensely satisfying. In most areas, instead of finishing off a location with an endgame collapse sequence like before, Ori introduced boss fight segments. The biggest criticism that I've seen brought up against these is that they drag out the ending of the game too much, and I can understand that. Having to vibe check a giant frog while simultaneously not moving forward in terms of the location does seem counterintuitive to Ori's inherent design and identity in solid platforming. On the other hand, I understand that I myself am a very competitive person, and because of that, being able to triumph over these monstrous creatures to seal off a location is far more gratifying to me than escaping scary water. Yeah! Finally! It took me nearly an hour to beat the frog on my first playthrough, but I can assure you that the dopamine release of beating that thing was way better than any in-game collapse segment in both this game and Blind Forest. Plus, I thought it was appropriate to introduce a new weapons and energy system with bosses because they were basically limit tests for how well those things could be utilized. Energy in the previous game was a system that felt marginal to the experience of Ori because the number of energy cells you had was basically equivalent to the number of save points you had available. Occasionally you'd have points where you'd have to use the energy you had to blow something up, or certain areas were locked off by an energy gate, but even then most of those events were necessary components of the main game. Now, energy is a far more integral part of puzzles littered throughout the game, and additionally allows the use of more powerful weapons. The main trade-off there, of course, being the energy required to use them. Then the developers had the great idea of, instead of making the save option based off of energy, they'd make the game auto-save fairly often. There are specific points in each location where the game will save, but for the most part it seems to be defined as once Ori touches the ground safely, the game will save. To top that change off, the game now includes a full-on regenerate ability, where Ori will channel for a couple of seconds to regenerate 3 life cells at the cost of 1 energy cell, and you get this ability pretty early on. Initially, I saw these 2 changes in the game and felt that they had made Ori far too easy, and in some ways it did, especially for the early game where your health bar is so small that 1 measly energy cell will heal you entirely, and you generally don't have the other weapons that cost a ton of energy to eliminate those larger targets. Besides, who needs to have another weapon when you have Hammer? Yet later on, juggling a heal that very easily burns through your energy and harder hitting weapons that cost more energy makes for a far more interesting interaction, because you often have to weigh how worthwhile that 3 health cell heal is versus more damage in energy scarce locations. When it came to puzzles though, they were usually fairly generous with how much energy they were willing to give the player. I'm assuming that was an anti-frustration mechanic so that you wouldn't be just shy of the amount of energy you needed, though it does feel odd when compared to how nuanced energy can be in more combative situations. With these changes to energy and saving your game, I'd say that Ori and the Will of the Wisps removes some of the frustration that came with the Blind Forest, and by extension you're allowed to enjoy Ori a whole lot more without having to worry about half-baked systems. I suppose that's a fancy way of saying that the game feels easier on normal difficulty, but even then, I've never seen Ori as a game that prided itself on its grueling difficulty. So, as a filthy casual, I welcome the changes. Spirit Light has been changed from something that you build up over time to then spend on an ability tree to a flat currency that you trade with NPCs for new weapons, charms that give you more passive benefits, and map segments. Now you may be thinking, wait a minute, these things have already been done, but in Hollow Knight 3 years ago. And while it's true that a lot of these new systems in place feel eerily similar, I think that it's dismissive to believe that 2 games in the same genre won't have some crossover in concepts. I finally figured it out. Quake is ripping off of Call of Duty because they both use guns. I liked the way Ori utilized its NPCs in their shops because instead of being pushed through a series of upgrades that I didn't care about like in the last game, I could set a goal for myself and save enough Spirit Light to get an upgrade or weapon that I was interested in using. And like I mentioned before though, the changes made to combat so that the weapons synced up better with your movement made some of them wickedly fun to use, and well worth the time spent to save up for them. Ori and the Will of the Wisps is best summarized as a true sequel to Ori and the Blind Forest because of how it expands on the previous game, and it shines best when working off the foundation laid before it. The energy system in combat was there previously, and it was greatly improved upon in the second game by making it more dynamic. Where I feel Ori and the Will of the Wisps is weakest is in terms of some of the new mechanics they introduced, namely the sand dive and the grappling hook. Now, these things are wickedly fun to use and further contribute to telling locations apart, sure. The desert is mostly defined by the sand diving, while areas surrounding the wellspring utilize the grappling hook the most. And when you get to the end segment, appropriately named Willow's End, it combines all those mechanics together as a proper nostalgic send-off to them. The grappling hook was a weird mechanic because the directional use was determined by holding a certain direction with the left analog stick or WASD keys if you're on keyboard, which if you're trying to redirect yourself mid-air can be detrimental when trying to simultaneously grapple onto a hook in the other direction. There's also some weird distance detection and gap size thing where if you're not close enough to a grappling surface and or there's a smaller gap in between you and the surface, then you won't be able to grapple on until you jump into a much closer range. It's weird because grappling hooks work just fine if they're in a wider space, but as soon as they're slightly behind a wall, it just won't work, fam. It was nice when it worked as expected, and awkward when it didn't. The same can be said of the sand dive, except where the grappling hook was fun and made some modicum of sense, I could not get the hang of the sand dive to save my life. On a surface level, it was like maneuvering and diving into water, but instead of having complete control over which direction I wanted to go, and even if I wanted to go in that direction, Ori constantly burrows straight through the sand and has the turning radius of a cruise ship. Hitting platforms doesn't stop you in your tracks, and anything non-lethal you hit, you awkwardly bounce off of, often back into something lethal. Furthermore, there would be an indicator that would light up when you're able to dash through certain sandy areas if you were in its range, but there seemed to be a fairly consistent delay on when you lost your opportunity to dash through that patch of sand versus when the indicator properly appeared or disappeared. It would have been nice if it worked as expected, but was more awkward to interact with for more than a split second at a time, and I sometimes would have rather it not existed at all. Sounds like a Tinder review for a date with me. Ori and the Will of the Wisps, an appropriately sized and thought out sequel to Ori and the Blind Forest. Even though I was immensely critical of the game throughout this review, the game is still set firmly in my mind as my favorite game of all time. I'm just recognizing that there are things that it can be criticized for. So I'll leave you all with this. Ori and the Will of the Wisps is my favorite game of all time. It's a heartwarming but often perilous adventure through the masterfully designed forest of Nguyen with some of the most satisfying platforming I have ever played, and a soundtrack that's guaranteed to tug at the heartstrings or make you hold your breath in suspense. It is not a perfect game by any stretch of the imagination, but in terms of what I look for in video games personally, Ori 2 hits all those markers and goes above and beyond expectations in some instances. All in all, solid game. I highly recommend you pick it up, and that's really all I have for this review. So thank you all so much for watching. If you like this review and want to see more content like this, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. So travel safe everyone, and goodbye.